Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with host Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode. Search for us on your favorite podcast app, or you can find the podcast on jimmyhinton.org and findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so we can spread the word. If you would like to support us and get exclusive rewards, go to patreon.com/speakingout. Find a tier that best fits you and join as a patron of the podcast. Now let's get into the show. Well, welcome to this week's podcast with host Jimmy Hinton.
And Jimmy's mom, Clara.
Good to be back. Good to be back in the saddle here recording.
Sure is.
A huge thank you to our sponsors, our patrons of the podcast. I should say patrons and not sponsors because they are not sponsors. But our patrons who love us and support us, and they make this podcast matter. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes.
This was actually a question that was asked to me by one of our listeners about what questions can we on the search committee ask other churches or people who are references for an incoming pastor. We're going to talk about that next week, so I'll put that little hook out there.
Okay.
This week, I think before we talk about that, I want to talk about what questions you should ask people in an interview. What should you actually ask the person who's applying for the position to be lead preacher? What are some of the questions that you ask? Incidentally, I went online and I looked for questions and came up fairly empty-handed. There were a couple websites that had some questions. I printed off some from a website called churchstaffing.com. And I'm just going to read through some of these. I'm going to kind of sprint through them really quickly. How did you come to the Lord? Number 2, at what moment did you realize that you were called to ministry, and why as a pastor or leader? Number 3, how would you define ministry? How would you define leadership? Number 4, what Christian leaders or pastors do you read, listen to, or follow? Number 5, who is your favorite theologian and why? Number 6, can you share an example of how you have handled a tragic situation that has directly or indirectly affected members of your congregation? Number 7, explain a time when you felt pushed beyond your capabilities as a leader and how you overcame this difficulty. Number 8, what is a God story that you can tell in order to encourage others? Number 9, share an example of how you have handled someone on your team or in the congregation not living according to biblical principle. Now, I like this little prompter. Now the soapbox, Jimmy's little soapbox is coming out. Let me just stand on it. We're going for a ride.
I knew
Mom,
it.
I'm going to let you read the little disclaimer on
Okay,
question
the
number
little
9.
disclaimer is listen for grace and love in their response while looking to the Bible for truth. So it is all about that good feeling of being kind and being forgiving and showing grace and mercy.
Can you imagine, just switching seats for a minute, can you imagine an abuser getting asked these questions?
He'd be really happy.
He would love them.
He would love it because
These are a dream come true.
Wow, absolutely.
I mean, I'm reading through these, and I'm not picking on the people who wrote these. I just my point is this: abuse in the church is not on the radar of people. It's not. When I browse websites, when I've been interviewed before for church positions, these are the kinds of questions that I was asked.
What's interesting to me, Jimmy, and by the way, I didn't see these until just a few moments ago. Jimmy and I were discussing them. But sitting on school board, when we interviewed teachers and administrators for positions, these are very similar questions.
Yeah.
What situation in the classroom was your hardest? Explain how you handled it. Kind of looking for the same type of thing. And it's very interesting to me that in the context of ministry, when you're talking about spirituality and God's church, that these are the kinds of questions that would be asked.
Yeah, well, I mean, another thing too is abusers are in the business of building facades, and not just
Mm-hmm.
abusers. I mean, religious people are often in the business of
Mm-hmm.
building facades, slapping the smile on the face, walking in, dressing in your Sunday best, making it look like, giving the appearance that your life is put together, that things are great, that things are wonderful, that God is just showering all these blessings on your life. And abusers especially are incredibly skilled at building facades.
Now, what
So
you're not saying, let me interject for fear of some people thinking that you are kind of insinuating that the majority of people who interview for such a position are just putting on nice clothes and build this facade to look good. That's not true. The majority, I do believe, are sincere
oh
and
yeah.
they are
Yeah.
godly people wanting to do God's work. However, mixed in with the sheep are the wolves, and the
Right.
wolves are experts.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, it's what
Yeah.
they do. So, I mean,
Right.
when you feed them questions where you're inviting them to tell this story about, like, what led you to the Lord,
Mm-hmm.
you don't think that they have this magnificent story already built. And I mean, they're going to wow the
Right.
people who are sitting
Mm-hmm.
across the desk from them. I guarantee it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so these kinds of questions don't challenge the person who's being interviewed, regardless of whether they're an abuser or not. And the other thing is, these questions are really generic. That same
I
question,
think,
that number
yeah,
9,
right.
share an example of how you have handled someone on your team
Yeah.
or in the
Yeah.
congregation not living according to biblical principle. What does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
Not living according to biblical, I mean, that is just wide open.
Mm-hmm.
And so an abuser they're gonna find something that the leaders will nod in approval of, and that they would find disapproving. They're gonna make up some kind of a story, and they're gonna paint this magnificent story of redemption, and how the person being interviewed came out the shining hero. He was the knight in shining armor. He saved the day, and by the way, he's gonna say, it wasn't me who did it, but it was the Lord.
Mm-hmm. It's
Um,
interesting when you think about interviews for churches. Very rarely, I think, are interview questions based from God's Word, knowledge of God's Word, interpretation of God's Word, or whatnot. But when you leave the interview, the words most often said, "Oh, man, he was a really nice guy," or
mhm.
"She was a
Yep.
really nice lady. She was somebody I feel we could work with."
Yeah, and I
And
remind people all the time,
mm,
kindness is it's a discipline. It's not a disposition.
right.
Kindness.
Yeah.
People are not naturally kind.
Mhm.
Nobody is.
Mhm.
None of us are naturally
Mhm.
kind. People try us and test us and push our buttons. And all of you parents know, if you have these little monsters with tails poking out of the back and little horns and pitchforks, you know what I'm talking about. They will push every button known to man. People are not naturally kind and soft and compassionate. It's a discipline. And so for abusers, they're incredibly disciplined and self-disciplined at showing kindness and compassion, and knowing when to bite their tongue, and knowing who to bite their tongue in front of. And so, yeah, Mom, you're exactly right.
Mhm.
When somebody walks out of an interview and you've asked these kinds of questions that don't challenge them hardly at all,
Right.
and they walk out and you've been wowed by that person, it's no wonder that abusers are slipping through the cracks really easily. I'll read these last three questions, and then we'll give you some of our questions that we would recommend, that we would ask, and I'll put these up on my website too. I'll, when I get a little bit of time, make a PDF of this that you guys can print off, and church leaders, if you want to use these, feel free. If you want to tweak them, feel free. These are not the end all, trust me. But going back to these other ones from what was that website called? Churchstaffing.com. Okay, the last three questions. How do you describe your approach to reflecting the love of Christ to people who are not accustomed to coming to church services and have not decided to do so? Not a bad question. None of these are really bad questions. So I'm not poking fun at that. But they don't dig real deep, and they don't really get to know the heart of the person who you're interviewing, especially when it comes to abuse. Number 11, can you tell me a little bit about your own relationship with the Lord and your personal devotional time? I mean, again, that's an abuser's dream come true.
Right.
Sure, let me tell you. And then they make up this grandiose story.
Well, and sometimes, Jimmy, the story is true.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
That's right.
In the case of your dad, he did hold Bible studies. He did pray all the time.
He did make visits in hospitals all the time.
He did all of that. He had prayers with people. He went to nursing homes, visited the sick and the lonely. So he did do that while he also was abusing children.
Yeah.
Oh, so
yep.
we need to get beyond these questions into the heart of what questions do we ask an abuser?
Yeah. Right. And finally, this question again it's a good question. There's nothing wrong with any of these questions. But they just they really don't help you get to the heart of the person you're interviewing. Number 12, how do you balance the needs of your family and self with those of a congregation? Okay, so we're going to spend the rest of the time and talk about questions that we came up with. There are only 6 of them, and we could probably add 60 more, really. So,
not today,
again,
so don't get too excited.
Right.
Yeah,
so for the sake
today.
of a podcast, these are probably some of the most important questions, but yeah, I mean, this is not a comprehensive list by any stretch of the imagination. Number 1, what is God's foundation? And the reason I ask this is going back to that number 9 on the other list. Share an example of how you've handled someone on your team or in the congregation not living according to biblical principle. And then this little hint, 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 wink, wink. Listen for grace and love in their response while looking to the Bible for truth. Why is grace and love an appropriate response if somebody was an abusive jerk in the church, if somebody was genuinely destroying the lives of people in the church? Why is grace and love an appropriate first response? And so one of the reasons that I asked this question, what is God's foundation, is because it's the most foundational question. If we get the foundation wrong, everything else that we build on that in our ministry is going to fail. It's going to be off kilter.
I'm going to interject something here. If our listeners would go way, way back to our first few podcasts, we went into depth about this very, very thought here. What is God's foundation? And it was explained so well. Jimmy, you did a beautiful job with that. So we based this entire podcast on God's foundation. And
we really unpacked it.
We did, So if people want to really hear a more in detail definition of this and explanation, please go back and listen to, those first few podcasts, because you really did unpack this well. Didn't mean to interrupt there, but I think
that's fine.
I think it's important that people know that.
Well, I ask this question just about every time I go and speak at a church. And, I'll just say, what is God's foundation? And I mean, never has anybody answered that right, and that's scary to me. I'll get things like, like this, love, it's mercy, it's grace, it's salvation, it's forgiveness. All of those are wrong. All of those are improper. They're not right, and foundations are important. And Psalm 89:14 says, righteousness and justice are your foundation. And steadfast love and faithfulness go before you. Righteousness and justice, and that, I'm not going to unpack it again here. Mom's right. We've talked about this in previous podcasts.
In full depth, yeah. I think we actually took 2 weeks to just talk about this basic truth here.
But righteousness and justice, if we don't get that right, and we begin with the building blocks of this foundation as forgiveness, of love, of mercy, of, we cheapen grace, and we begin to turn a blind eye immediately. Like even in that question, hint, look for answers that are full of love and mercy. Why? God's first response often, Jesus's first response often, was get away from my sheep. You don't belong anywhere near these people because you're destroying them. Get away from them. That's a proper first response for somebody who's intentionally destroying the lives. So, that question is really important to me. Number 2, what is Jesus's mission? What was his mission when he was here on earth? He sums it up in Luke chapter 4 in 2 sentences when he's quoting from Isaiah. If you don't know what Jesus' mission was, if you don't know why he was here on planet Earth, then you probably don't belong in the pulpit. These little fluffy stories, tell me about a time when Jesus changed your life. I can make anything up. But if I can't answer this question, why was Jesus here? What was his mission? Who was he after? Who did he spend his time and his energy and his efforts protecting and defending? And who was he protecting and defending them from? And what did he say to the people to whom he was shielding the innocent people from? What did he say? What was his message to them? It wasn't love and mercy and grace.
It wasn't
come
all sweet.
Come to me, and I'll
sweet
bring you in too.
For sure, no.
So that's an important question. Number 3, because abuse is so rampant in the church, it's in every church. Period. This question, number 3: if an adult in the church came to you and told you that a current member, somebody who's still there at the church, had sexually abused her when she was a child, how would you respond? Would you say, well, that, how long ago was that? How old is this church member who's coming to you? Is this a 50-year-old woman who's, dredging up all this stuff in the past? Is she emptying the trash can all over the floor of the church and, digging up old trash? That's one of the sayings that people use. If that's the response from somebody, is how long ago? If that's their first response, is how long ago did this happen? That's a huge red flag.
That's a no. Yeah, it is. This question, Jimmy, in all practicality, is probably not going to be asked ever or very few times during an interview. You know it, and I know it, because most churches are not on the same plateau. They're not on the same wavelength with each other, even, let alone interview a pastor and ask, how would you respond to this?
Yeah.
Because the elders and the, deacons and whatnot, they don't know how to respond. Or if they do know how, they're not responding most of the time in the proper way. So,
but it needs to be asked, because this is such a common problem.
I love that you have it in here as part of this guide. We need some wake up and shake up calls.
Yeah.
For sure.
Number 4, this is a scenario that you would give to the interviewee. So several people have privately complained that longtime member and one of the church elders, not only has this person been here a long time, but it's one of our elders, one of your elders. Somebody came to you privately and said, this guy's too close to children. And then a Sunday school teacher comes to you privately to say that one of her small children said that he cries when he sees this particular elder because, in the words of the kid, I saw his pee-pee. How do you respond? If they have to stop and think about that and, again, and they're asking more specific questions like, how long ago was this? Or was, is it possible that the kid is maybe making things up? Or, if they run to this false accusation, if that's where their mind goes and says, I would probably have to determine if this was a false accusation. If that's their first response, another huge red flag. Mm-hmm. The first response, and it shouldn't even take any hesitation, and this is even for untrained people, is I'm reporting it.
Right.
I don't care if this is an elder.
Again, right, how many churches in actuality would be on the same page with that, which is sad.
And that's the law.
It is.
I mean, by the way, they're mandated in almost every state. This pastor who was given this information of a minor child would be required to report that.
Right.
And I think that's kind of interesting, and I say, like, regardless of their training, or as Merriam-Webster now has added this to their dictionary, irregardless of their training.
All right.
Does that grind on you a little bit? Does that grind on any of you listeners that irregardless is now recognized as a real word?
No, because I use that word.
Oh my goodness.
I know.
You're fired.
I know how to use it. Oh, I know.
What's this world coming to? Irregardless.
Yep. That's my word.
I digress. Regardless of whether somebody has training or not, the first response from a common sense perspective, from a moral perspective, from an ethical perspective, and from a spiritual perspective ought to be, I'm going to the police and I'm reporting this. Period. I think back, Mom, to when you and I heard not from a child, but from an adult who we technically were not required, because she was an adult, we were not required to report that. What was our first response?
Right away.
We're reporting it.
We're going, we have
Wasn't even a question. No. You and I did not. No. We didn't list all these different scenarios and, different avenues that we could take this information. You and I it was one quick phone call. I called you up, and we both immediately recognized we're reporting this. Yeah. It wasn't even a question.
No.
That ought to be the first response. Okay, question number 5. This is probably the most hot topic, hot button issue that I face in my advocacy work in the church. And that is, what do you do with the registered sex offenders that leaders know about, and they work so hard to keep the church from finding out? So here's the scenario that you give somebody in an interview. A new visitor has been attending for several months. He was a former pastor and has a vast knowledge of the scriptures. Everyone really enjoys him, and he hasn't caused any problems. He shares privately that he was falsely accused of sexual abuse and is now on the registry. The church is unaware that he's on the registry, and he would like to keep it that way due to the embarrassment this would bring to his family. Now, his family knows about this, obviously, because he spent time in prison. He's on the registry, but this guy's saying, for the sake of my family, I don't want the church to find out, because this would be really embarrassing for them, and et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so are you tracking with me so far? His former church leaders vouch for his character and ability to teach and lead well. They don't think he was falsely accused, but they think he learned his lesson in prison, and that God's mercy is for all, regardless of what they have done. How will you respond? Now, if that's not a loaded question, I don't know what is.
That's a question and a half, Jimmy. Yeah. Question and a half.
This is one of the most common scenarios that I face, and one of the most poorly handled by church leaders, in my opinion. In the 9 years that I've been doing advocacy work, typically, almost always, the church leaders will oblige. They'll have compassion on this guy. They'll buy the narrative that this was a false accusation. They won't pull up his records. They won't call the investigative police officer. They won't look up court dockets. They won't even dig up the sex offender registry, which is just really generic. It'll just give kind of a generic what the charge was and how long they're on the registry for. They won't even go that far. And so the question is, will you, as a pastor, will you go along with this? Would you go along with this, and would you help keep this a secret, or would you submit to the elders or elder board or whoever it is who's above you? Would you submit to them if they were trying to keep this a secret, or would you blow the whistle and tell the church? That is a really important question.
Well, it's a pivotal question, because when this is allowed, you and I know what happens. I mean, we understand what happens. We put children at risk. I believe you would be safe to say 100% of the time there's going to be abuse of some sort happen when this person is allowed to be in the church. No good comes from it covering up the sexual abuse, and when you believe something that this person has been falsely accused, that person wouldn't be on the registry if they had been falsely accused. And it's funny how we can twist things when a person tells us, but I really didn't do that. They nailed me on something and they twisted it to make it look like I did this, but I really didn't.
Right.
And then we believe it because you get all this praise from others and say, well, he is really a super person. He knows the Bible. People love him. He can handle any situation in the church. He's a good boy,
and because he's sitting right in front of you,
and he's right
and
there.
we think that we're really good at telling when somebody's lying to us, and you would think, why would this person even bring up that he's on the registry if he's going to lie about it?
Absolutely.
And so abusers know this about us, about other church leaders, and so that they can paint whatever narrative they want. So this is incredibly common. This scenario, I mean, I literally plucked this out of 50 or more case studies that I've personally dealt with. So this is not like a really rare hypothetical that Jimmy's just coming up with this off the top of his head.
No.
Like, this is a common scenario. And by the way, if somebody who's interviewing for a position is an abuser, you know how they're going to answer a question like this? Well, I would definitely try to protect, for the sake of his family. I would I would honor that wish,
right,
and I would protect the identity of this man, and this good man. And after all, he's a good Bible teacher. An abuser will show empathy towards the
Yeah.
abuser. An abuser who's applying for a position and gets a question like this isn't going to be like, I'd grab him by the scruff of his neck and I'd toss him out the door.
Yeah.
They're not going to answer that
No.
way.
You know what's weird when you think about it? We get very uncomfortable talking about sin of any kind. We really do. And when we approach someone about sin, we get really uncomfortable most of the time. And I think that's part of avoiding questions like this. We don't like to do it. We simply don't like to.
So we ask the fluffy questions that tell me about your journey with Jesus.
Well, what was your God moment? We want to hear those things because they're easier to listen to. The hard stuff is here. This is hard stuff. This is not easy. It would not be an easy interview. It would not be easy for either the person being interviewed or the person that is doing the interviewing. This is hard stuff. And we all don't like pain. We avoid painful things as much as possible. And I think that's another reason these questions aren't brought up, also for fear of heaven forbid, being misinterpreted as having a hint of judgment in it. We don't want to do that. And we backpedal. We backpedal and we soften everything. We truly do.
Yeah. And then number 6, finally, this question: how would you make church a safe place for the oppressed, poor, and the sick? And I think that's a pretty open-ended question where, it's not necessarily asking about serving them, because that's another question altogether. They should be served. They should be well taken care of. But the question is framed in a way that what culture will you create and cultivate to keep vulnerable people safe, hurting people safe? What culture will you create? What would that look like to you? Not serving, not putting food on a plate for the poor. I'm not talking about the soup kitchens and things like that, which are incredible ministries. They're really important ministries, but that's not what I'm talking about. This is a cultural question that really gets to the heart of the person who's interviewing for this position. What would you do to make this a safe place for people who have no other place that's safe? And oftentimes the church is not a safe place. In fact, most times the church is not a safe environment for these people. What would you do to change that? Or to create it? So anyway, again, this is not a comprehensive list by any stretch of the imagination. And if you guys have other questions that you would like to see added to this list, please let us know. Comment whenever we post this episode. Comment on Facebook, on Twitter. Let us know what you guys would add to this list. I hope we get a lot of feedback
on this, because it's so vitally important to our churches and to our, to weeding out, if you want to call it that, our church leaders, to finding those that are, pure and honest and good, and that know what God's foundation is and what the mission of Jesus was. These questions are pertinent. They're critical. So really, if our listeners would please, respond, let us hear from you. Let us hear your thoughts. I know that there are more questions that should be asked. Maybe some of these could be framed in a better way, but let us hear from you.
And I want to hear too what survivors would church leaders to ask somebody who coming in,
right?
And this is not just to find out if they're an abusive person or not, but legitimately, like if your church or a church was hiring a preacher, they're hiring a full-time preacher. You as a survivor who's going to be sitting at the feet of this person who the search committee is looking at, what questions would you want to ask that person? If you were the one sitting at the table on the search committee and you were able to ask any question, what would those questions be?
Let us know. Please respond. Yes, please respond. to that.
All right. Well, looks like we are out of time. So next week, again, we'll be talking about what questions you can ask former churches where these pastors served, or people who are people of reference for them. What do you do when you pick up the phone and call them? What do you ask them? We'll talk about that next week. Thanks
Okay, Jimmy,
Oh,
give us a truth bomb.
Oh,
yeah, we can't close without that.
Yeah,
Please.
so truth bomb is that it is vital for us to get this right. When we're hiring people, when we are hiring people who are going to stand before the congregation and who are in charge of the souls and the spiritual health of our congregation, we've got to get this right. Put some thought into this. And church leaders take the hiring process very, very seriously. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll catch you next episode.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode. Thank you to our patrons who make the podcast possible. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker and search for the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast in your favorite podcast app. Be sure to hit subscribe and rate the show. If you believe in what we do, consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron and check out the cool rewards our patrons receive. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.